In the summer of 1983, 17 children boarded a yellow school bus for what should have been the adventure of their young lives. None of them would ever return home. For 42 years, their families lived with questions that seemed impossible to answer. Where did they go? What happened on that sunny Tuesday morning in June? And why did the trail go completely cold? The story begins in the small town of Millbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York, population 3,000, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where doors are left unlocked, and where the biggest news usually involves the high school football team or the annual county fair. It was the kind of community where parents felt safe sending their children on overnight trips without a second thought. St. Mary's Elementary School had organized the summer excursion as part of their annual enrichment program. The destination was Camp Whispering Pines, a rustic retreat about 2 hours north, where children would spend 3 days hiking, swimming, and learning about nature. The trip was supervised by 2 teachers, Margaret Stone and David Collins, both beloved figures in the community who had been organizing these trips for over a decade. The morning of June 14th dawned clear and bright, a perfect day for an adventure. Parents gathered at the school parking lot, saying goodbye to their excited children. There were hugs, last-minute reminders about sunscreen and being careful, and promises to bring back souvenirs from the gift shop. The atmosphere was festive, filled with the kind of anticipation that only comes at the beginning of summer vacation. Among the children was 8-year-old Sarah Chen, whose parents had moved to Millbrook just 2 years earlier, when her father took a job at the local bank. Sarah was quiet but curious, the kind of child who collected rocks and pressed flowers between the pages of old books. Her mother, Linda, had packed her daughter's favorite stuffed rabbit, a worn pink bunny named Buttons, that had been Sarah's constant companion since she was 3. Then there was Tommy Rodriguez, age 9, whose infectious laugh could be heard from 3 blocks away. Tommy lived with his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 5. Maria Rodriguez had raised him with the help of the tight-knit Hispanic community in Millbrook, and Tommy had grown into a resilient, joyful child who seemed to find wonder in everything around him. The Collins twins, Emma and Ethan, were 10 years old and inseparable. Their father owned the local hardware store, and both children had inherited his practical nature and problem-solving skills. Emma was the more outgoing of the 2, while Ethan preferred to observe before acting. Their mother, Janet, had spent the morning making sure they had matching water bottles and enough snacks to feed a small army. 12-year-old Marcus Washington was the oldest of the group, a natural leader who looked out for the younger children. His parents, both teachers at the high school, had instilled in him a strong sense of responsibility and kindness. Marcus had been looking forward to this trip for months, especially the chance to try rock climbing at the camp's artificial wall. The bus itself was a standard yellow school bus, model year 1978, driven by Frank Morrison, a man who had been transporting Millbrook's children safely for over 15 years. Frank was known for his gentle demeanor and his collection of terrible jokes that somehow always made the kids laugh. He had 2 children of his own, and understood the precious cargo he carried every day. As the children climbed aboard that morning, there was the usual chaos of finding seats, storing backpacks, and settling in for the journey. Teacher Margaret Stone, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, took her customary seat near the front, while David Collins, younger and more energetic, positioned himself in the middle of the bus, where he could keep an eye on the more rambunctious student. The bus pulled away from St. Mary's at exactly 9:15 in the morning. Parents waved from the parking lot, some snapping photos with their cameras, others simply watching until the yellow vehicle disappeared around the corner. It was the last time any of them would see their children alive. The planned route was straightforward, taking them north on Highway 23 through a series of small towns and rural areas. Before reaching the camp, the journey should have taken approximately 2 hours, with arrival scheduled for 11:30. Margaret Stone had made this trip countless times and knew every landmark along the way. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. The children sang songs, played word games, and chattered excitedly about the activities waiting for them at camp. Frank Morrison kept up his usual banter over the bus's intercom system, telling jokes and pointing out interesting sights along the road. It was exactly the kind of trip that had made these summer excursions so popular with families in Millbrook. The last confirmed sighting of the bus came at 10:45 in the morning. A state trooper named Officer James Park was conducting routine traffic patrol when he noticed the yellow school bus stopped at a rest area about 15 miles from the camp. He later reported that everything appeared normal. The bus was parked properly, and he could see adults and children moving around outside, apparently taking a bathroom break. Officer Park drove past without stopping, as there was no indication of any problem. This decision would haunt him for the rest of his career. In the official report filed later, he described seeing the bus driver, a middle-aged man in a plaid shirt, standing near the front of the vehicle. Several children were visible playing on the grass nearby, while two adults who appeared to be teachers were organizing the group. At 11:30, when the bus failed to arrive at Camp Whispering Pines, the camp director, Robert Hayes, assumed they had encountered traffic or stopped for a longer break. Summer trips often ran a bit behind schedule, and it was not uncommon for groups to arrive 30 or 40 minutes late. He and his staff continued their preparations, setting up the cabins and preparing lunch. By 12:30, however, concern began to creep in. Hayes called St. Mary's Elementary School to check on the bus's progress. The school secretary, Miss Patterson, assured him that the trip had departed on schedule and suggested he contact the bus company directly. When Hayes called the transportation company, they had no additional information but promised to radio the driver. The radio calls went unanswered. Frank Morrison, who had always been reliable about maintaining contact during trips, seemed to have vanished into thin air along with his precious cargo. By 1 o'clock, genuine alarm had set in. Hayes contacted the state police, and within minutes, a search effort was underway. The first patrol cars reached the last confirmed sighting at the rest area by 1:30. They found no trace of the bus, no indication of where it might have gone, and no witnesses who remembered seeing a yellow school bus with children. It was as if the vehicle had simply evaporated into the summer air. As word spread through Millbrook, parents began arriving at the school demanding answers that no one could provide. The parking lot that had been filled with cheerful goodbyes just hours earlier now buzzed with anxiety and growing fear. Phone calls flew between families, all hoping that someone somewhere had heard something that might explain where their children had gone. Linda Chen was among the first parents to arrive. She had been at her job at the library when the call came, and she drove to the school with her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. The last thing she had said to Sarah was to remember to brush her teeth before bed, such a mundane parental reminder that now seemed impossibly precious. Maria Rodriguez came next, her face pale but determined. She had raised Tommy through loss before, and she was not about to give up hope now. She carried with her a small wooden cross that had belonged to her own mother, clutching it tightly as she joined the growing crowd of worried parents. The Collins parents arrived together, Janet gripping her husband's hand so tightly that her knuckles were white. They had never been apart from the twins for more than a few hours, and the thought of Emma and Ethan being somewhere unknown and potentially dangerous was almost unbearable. By evening, the search had expanded to include dozens of police officers, volunteers, and even some National Guard units. Helicopters flew overhead, scanning the dense forests and rural areas where the bus might have gotten lost or broken down. Search dogs followed potential trails, but none led to any concrete evidence. The media descended on Millbrook like a plague of locusts. News vans lined the main street. Reporters thrust microphones into the faces of grieving parents, and the story of the missing school bus began to spread across the country. The small town that had prided itself on its peaceful anonymity was suddenly thrust into the harsh glare of national attention. As the first day turned into the first night, hope began to fade. If the bus had simply broken down, someone would have found it by now. If there had been an accident, there would be wreckage, debris, some sign of what had happened. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing. The search continued through the night, illuminated by floodlights and the desperate determination of people who refused to accept that 17 children and 3 adults could simply disappear without a trace. But as dawn broke on June 15th, the reality began to sink in. Something terrible had happened to that yellow school bus and everyone aboard it. The second day brought federal involvement. The FBI arrived in unmarked cars, setting up a command center in the school gymnasium. Special agents interviewed every parent, every teacher, every person who had been at the school that morning. They examined the bus company's records, investigated the backgrounds of the driver and teachers, and began the painstaking process of retracing every possible route the bus might have taken. Agent Patricia Walsh, a seasoned investigator with 20 years of experience, took charge of the case. She had worked missing persons cases before, but never one involving so many children. The pressure was enormous, not just from the families and the media, but from her own conscience. Every hour that passed reduced the chances of finding the children alive. The investigation revealed that Frank Morrison had been a model employee with no history of erratic behavior or personal problem. His wife confirmed that he had been excited about the trip and had spent the previous evening checking the bus's mechanical systems to ensure everything was in perfect working order. There was no indication that he had any connection to the disappearance beyond being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Margaret Stone and David Collins were similarly cleared of any suspicion. Both had impeccable records, were beloved by their students and colleagues, and had no reason to harm the children in their care. If anything, they were likely victims themselves, caught up in whatever had befallen the bus. As the search entered its third day, the focus shifted from rescue to recovery. The hope that the children might be found alive began to dim, replaced by the grim determination to find out what had happened and to bring those responsible to justice. But even that goal seemed increasingly elusive as the investigation hit one dead end after another. The families refused to give up. They organized their own search parties, distributed flyers with the children's photographs, and maintained a constant vigil at the school. The community rallied around them, providing food, comfort, and whatever support they could offer. But nothing could fill the terrible void left by the missing children. Local psychics and self-proclaimed experts began to emerge, offering their services and theories about what might have happened. Some claimed the children had been taken by a cult. Others suggested they had been victims of human trafficking, and a few even proposed that they had been abducted by extraterrestrials. The police investigated every credible lead, but none produced any evidence. The media coverage intensified, with national news programs featuring the story nightly. The faces of the 17 children became familiar to millions of Americans, their school pictures appearing on television screens and newspaper front pages across the country. The case became a symbol of every parent's worst nightmare, the fear that something terrible could happen to their child in an instant, without warning or explanation. As summer turned to fall, the search began to wind down. The FBI maintained an active investigation, but with no new leads and no evidence, there was little they could do except wait and hope that someone somewhere would come forward with information. The families continued their vigil, but the crowds of supporters gradually dwindled, and life in Millbrook slowly began to return to something resembling normal. The school year began without the missing children. Their empty desks stood as silent monuments to their absence, and their teachers struggled to maintain some sense of normalcy in the face of such profound loss. The annual Christmas pageant was canceled, the spring field day was quietly eliminated, and the summer enrichment program was permanently suspended. Years passed, and the case grew cold. New investigators were assigned as old ones retired or moved on to other cases. The evidence boxes were moved to storage. The command center was dismantled, and the daily press conferences became weekly, then monthly, then stopped altogether. But the families never stopped hoping, never stopped searching, and never stopped demanding answers. The missing children became a part of Millbrook's identity, their story told and retold, their memory preserved in a small memorial garden behind the school. Every year on June 14th, the community held a remembrance service, and every year the families gathered to share their memories and to renew their pledge to never give up hope. Some families moved away, unable to bear the constant reminders of their loss. Others stayed, determined to be there when their children were found. Marriages strained under the weight of grief, some ending in divorce, others strengthened by shared sorrow. The ripple effects of that summer day in 1983 continued to spread through the community for decades. As the years turned into decades, the case became something of a legend, a cautionary tale told to warn parents about the dangers that lurk in the world. True crime enthusiasts picked over the details. Amateur investigators proposed new theories, and the story found new life on internet forums and podcasts. But still, No one had any real answers about what had happened to those 17 children and their 3 guardians. The investigation officially remained open, a cold case that haunted the FBI and local law enforcement. Every few years a new lead would emerge, a potential witness would come forward, or a new technology would offer hope for breakthrough. But each time, the trail led nowhere, and the mystery deepened. In 2010, 27 years after the disappearance, the case was featured on a popular television show about unsolved mystery. The episode generated hundreds of new tips, but none provided the breakthrough that investigators had hoped for. The case remained as mysterious as ever, a puzzle with missing pieces that seemed impossible to find. The families, now grandparents and great-grandparents, continued their vigil. They had grown older, their hair had turned gray, and their faces had been lined by decades of worry. But their determination remained unshaken. They organized annual fundraisers to keep the investigation active, maintained websites with updated information, and never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would learn the truth about what happened to their children. By 2020, most of the original investigators had retired or passed away. The case files had been digitized and stored in computer databases, but the physical evidence remained in boxes in a climate-controlled warehouse. The yellow school bus that had carried 17 children into oblivion had become the subject of folklore, its fate as mysterious as that of its passengers. As the 40th anniversary of the disappearance approached, the media began to take notice again. Documentary filmmakers reached out to the families, podcasters dug into the case files, and a new generation of investigators began to examine the evidence with fresh eyes. The story of the missing school bus found new audiences, and with them, new hope that someone, somewhere, might have the key to solving the mystery. But hope, as the families had learned over 4 decades of waiting, was a fragile thing. It could sustain you through the darkest times, but it could also be crushed by the weight of repeated disappointments. As June 14, 2023 approached, marking the 40th anniversary of the disappearance, the families prepared for another year of remembrance, another year of waiting, another year of questions without answer. None of them could have imagined that this anniversary would be different, that the breakthrough they had prayed for was finally about to come. The discovery that would change everything was just months away, buried beneath 42 years of secrets and lies, waiting to be uncovered by a stroke of luck and the persistence of those who refused to give up. The autumn of 2025 arrived early in upstate New York, painting the rolling hills in brilliant shades of orange and red. It had been 42 years since the disappearance of the school bus, and most of the world had moved on. But in a small construction trailer parked beside a half-built housing development, a discovery was about to unfold that would shake the very foundations of everything people thought they knew about that summer day. Jake Morrison was 28 years old, a heavy equipment operator who had been working construction since he graduated high school. He had no connection to the missing children, no knowledge of their story beyond what he might have heard in passing. To him, the Millbrook case was ancient history, something that happened before he was born. He was focused on more immediate concerns, like meeting his quota for the day and getting home in time for dinner with his girlfriend. The development where Jake worked was called Sunset Ridge, a planned community of 200 homes that would eventually house young families fleeing the high costs of city living. The site was located about 30 miles northeast of Millbrook, in an area that had been farmland for generations before being sold to developers. It was the kind of place where suburbia met rural America, where new construction sat alongside old barns and century-old farmhouses. Jake had been operating his excavator for 3 days, digging foundations for the houses that would line Maple Street. The work was routine, methodical, the kind of job that let his mind wander while his hands worked automatically. He was thinking about the weekend, about the fishing trip he had planned with his father, when the bucket of his excavator struck something that definitely was not supposed to be there. At first he thought it was a large rock or maybe an old septic tank. Such obstacles were common in rural construction sites, remnants of the area's agricultural past. But as he carefully scraped away more soil, the shape that emerged was distinctly artificial and somehow familiar. It was yellow, faded and dirty, but unmistakably yellow. Jake shut off his equipment and climbed down for a closer look. What he saw made his blood run cold. Partially buried in the earth was the roof of what appeared to be a school bus. Not just any school bus, but one that had been intentionally buried, covered with soil and left to rot for decades. The realization of what he had found hit him like a physical blow. His first instinct was to call his supervisor, but something made him pause. If this was what he thought it was, if this was the missing bus from the famous case, then this was bigger than a construction delay. This was the answer to a mystery that had haunted families for over 4 decades. With trembling hands, Jake pulled out his cell phone and called 911. The first responders arrived within minutes, followed quickly by county sheriff's deputies and then by state police. Within an hour, the construction site had been transformed into a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape and crawling with investigators. The FBI was contacted, and by evening, Agent Sarah Chen, who had taken over the cold case 5 years earlier, was on the scene. Agent Chen was the daughter of Linda Chen, one of the parents who had lost a child on that school bus. She had been born 2 years after her sister Sarah's disappearance, named in honor of the sister she had never met. Her entire life had been shaped by the shadow of that tragedy, and she had joined the FBI with the specific goal of solving cold cases, like this one. The irony that she was now investigating her own sister's disappearance was not lost on her. The excavation of the bus was a painstaking process that took 3 full days. Every scoop of soil was carefully sifted, every piece of debris cataloged and preserved. The bus itself was photographed from every angle before being slowly, carefully lifted from its earthen grave. The yellow paint was faded and peeling, the windows were cracked and covered with decades of grime, but the basic structure remained intact. As the bus was finally freed from the ground, a collective gasp went up from the gathered investigators. This was clearly the missing St. Mary's school bus, identifiable by its license plate and the small dent in the rear bumper that had been noted in the original police report. After 42 years, the first piece of the puzzle had finally been found, but the discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had the bus come to be buried in this remote location? Who had put it there, and why? Most importantly, where were the 17 children and 3 adults who had been aboard when it disappeared? The bus was empty, its seats intact but devoid of any human remains or personal belongings. The interior of the bus told a strange story. The seats were arranged normally, with no sign of struggle or violence. Personal items were scattered throughout, as if the passengers had simply vanished mid-journey. There was Sarah Chen's small backpack, still containing her drawing pad and a half-eaten sandwich. Tommy Rodriguez's baseball cap was found wedged between 2 seats. The Collins twins' matching water bottles were still in their holders, the contents long since evaporated. Margaret Stone's purse was discovered beneath the driver's seat, its contents scattered but identifiable. Her driver's license, credit cards, and a small photo of her grandchildren were all there, covered with decades of dust and moisture. David Collins' clipboard, with the trip roster and emergency contact information, was found on the floor near the front of the bus. The driver's seat held perhaps the most puzzling evidence. Frank Morrison's thermos was still in its holder, and his logbook was open to the page for June 14, 1983. The final entry, written in his careful handwriting, simply read, 10:30 a.m. Rest stop, all passengers accounted for. There was no indication of what had happened after that mundane notation. Forensic specialists began their examination of the bus immediately. They searched for fingerprints, DNA evidence, anything that might provide a clue about what had happened to the passenger. The preliminary findings were baffling. There was no evidence of violence, no blood stains, no sign of struggle. It was as if the 20 people aboard had simply evaporated, leaving behind only their belongings. The burial site itself provided additional mystery. The bus had been placed in a carefully excavated pit, then covered with soil and organic matter that had been allowed to decompose naturally. The work required significant planning and heavy equipment, suggesting that this was not a spontaneous act. Someone had known exactly where to put the bus, and had taken great care to ensure it would remain hidden. Soil analysis revealed that the bus had been buried within weeks of the disappearance, while the earth was still soft from spring rain. This timeline eliminated the possibility that the bus had been moved years later, which meant that whoever was responsible had acted quickly after the initial crime. The location was also significant, far enough from the main road to avoid casual discovery, but accessible enough for heavy machinery. As news of the discovery spread, the media descended on the construction site like a flock of vultures. The story of the buried school bus became international news, with reporters from around the world arriving to cover the latest development in one of America's most famous cold cases. The families of the missing children,
now elderly and frail, were thrust back into the spotlight they had tried so hard to avoid. Linda Chen, now 73 years old and confined to a wheelchair, was among the first to arrive at the scene. She had never given up hope that her daughter would be found, and the discovery of the bus, while not providing the answers she sought, at least confirmed that her railed story was real. She sat in her wheelchair, staring at the yellow vehicle that had carried her daughter into oblivion, tears streaming down her weathered face. Maria Rodriguez, now 85 and living in a nursing home, was too frail to travel to the site, but she watched the news coverage with a mixture of hope and despair. Tommy's baseball cap, still recognizable after all these years, was a tangible link to the grandson she had lost. Her caregiver later reported that she clutched her wooden cross and whispered prayers in Spanish until well past midnight. The Collins parents, now in their late 70s, arrived together as they had done everything for the past 42 years. They held hands as they viewed the bus, their faces etched with the pain of decades of waiting. Janet Collins later told reporters that seeing the twins' water bottles had nearly broken her heart all over again. They were so excited about that trip, she said. They talked about it for weeks. The investigation into the buried bus quickly became the largest cold case operation in FBI history. Agents from around the country were assigned to the case, and experts in archaeology, forensics, and criminal psychology were brought in to examine every aspect of the discovery. The bus was transported to a secure facility where it could be examined in detail, away from the prying eyes of the media and the public. The forensic examination revealed more puzzling details. The bus's engine showed no signs of mechanical failure, and the fuel tank was still nearly full. The tires were properly inflated, and the vehicle appeared to have been in good working condition when it was buried. This eliminated the possibility that the bus had broken down and been abandoned. More intriguingly, the bus's odometer showed that it had traveled approximately 60 miles beyond its last known location. This suggested that whoever had taken control of the vehicle had driven it for about an hour before reaching the burial site. The route they had taken remained a mystery, as there were no witnesses and no security cameras in the rural area.
The investigation team began to map out possible routes from the rest stop where the bus was last seen to the location where it was buried. There were several possibilities, but all led through sparsely populated rural areas where a school bus might pass unnoticed. The kidnapper or kidnappers had clearly chosen their route carefully, avoiding main roads and populated areas. As the technical examination continued, investigators began to focus on the human element of the case. Who had the knowledge, resources, and motivation to pull off such an elaborate crime? The operation would have required significant planning, access to heavy equipment, and detailed knowledge of the local area. This was not the work of a casual criminal or a mentally disturbed individual acting on impulse. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a profile of the likely perpetrator or perpetrator. They were looking for someone with local knowledge, possibly connected to the construction or farming industry, who had access to excavation equipment and the ability to transport 20 people without detection. The profile suggested a well-organized individual or group with strong ties to the community. Detective work focused on identifying anyone who might have had a grudge against the school, the teachers, or the children's family. The investigation revealed a few potential suspects, but none with clear motives or opportunities. The randomness of the victims, children from different families with no obvious connections, made it difficult to identify a specific target or motive. One theory that emerged was that the crime was connected to organized crime or human trafficking. The 1980s had seen an increase in such activities, and the remote location of the burial site suggested professional criminal involvement. However, investigations into known criminal organizations in the area during that time period revealed no connections to the missing persons case. Another possibility was that the crime was committed by someone with a personal connection to one of the victims. Investigators re-examined the backgrounds of all the families involved, looking for anyone who might have had a reason to target specific children or adults. This line of inquiry also proved fruitless, as all the victims appeared to have been chosen randomly. The discovery of the bus also prompted a re-examination of other cold cases from the same time period. Investigators looked for similar disappearances, unexplained deaths, or suspicious activities that might be connected to the school bus case. This broader investigation revealed several interesting leads, but none that provided definitive answers. As autumn turned to winter, the investigation continued with renewed intensity. The FBI announced a substantial reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of those responsible for the crime. The reward, funded by donations from the public and contributions from the families, was the largest ever offered for a cold case in that region. The media coverage of the case also intensified, with numerous documentaries, podcasts, and television specials focusing on the latest development. The story of the buried school bus captured the public imagination, and amateur investigators around the world began offering their own theories about what had happened to the missing children and adults. Social media played a significant role in keeping the case in the public eye. Hashtags like Buried Bus Mystery and Find the 17 began trending, and online communities dedicated to solving the case attracted thousands of members. While most of the online theories were far-fetched, some provided valuable insights that helped investigators focus their effort. The families of the missing children found themselves once again thrust into the spotlight. Many had spent decades trying to rebuild their lives after the tragedy, and the renewed attention was both welcome and overwhelming. Some embraced the opportunity to share their stories and keep their loved ones' memories alive, while others struggled with the invasion of their privacy. The discovery of the bus also brought closure to some aspects of the case while opening new questions. The families now knew that their loved ones had not simply run away or been taken far from home. The bus had been within 50 miles of their starting point all along, buried beneath the earth while they searched in vain for answers. But the most important questions remained unanswered. Where were the 17 children and 3 adults who had been aboard the bus? Were they still alive, held captive somewhere for over 4 decades? Had they been killed? And if so, where were their remains? The discovery of the empty bus was both a breakthrough and a new form of torture for the families who had waited so long for answers. As winter deepened and the investigation continued, it became clear that solving this case would require more than traditional detective work. The perpetrators had planned their crime carefully, covering their tracks and leaving few clues. But they had made one mistake. They had assumed that the bus would never be found. Now that it had been discovered, investigators had their first real evidence in over 40 years. The forensic examination of the bus continued through the winter months, with specialists using advanced techniques that had not been available in DNA analysis, chemical testing, and microscopic examination of trace evidence. All provided new insights into what had happened on that fateful day. While the results were not immediately conclusive, they began to paint a picture of a crime that was far more complex and premeditated than anyone had imagined. As spring approached, bringing with it the 43rd anniversary of the disappearance, investigators prepared for a new phase of the investigation. The discovery of the bus had generated hundreds of new leads, and each one needed to be carefully examined and followed up. The case that had once seemed hopeless now seemed solvable, if only they could find the right clues and ask the right questions. The families of the missing children prepared for another anniversary, but this time with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The discovery of the bus had brought them closer to the truth than they had ever been, but it had also raised the possibility that the truth might be more terrible than they had imagined. After 42 years of waiting, they were finally on the verge of answers, but they were not certain they were ready for what those answers might reveal. The spring of 2026 brought with it a sense of anticipation that had been building since the bus's discovery 6 months early. The FBI's investigation had reached a critical juncture, with new evidence emerging almost daily from the painstaking forensic examination of the vehicle and its content. What they found would ultimately reveal a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the community, involving people who had been trusted guardians of the children they had betrayed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Emily Watson, a forensic archaeologist, brought in to examine the burial site, made a discovery that would change everything. While conducting a detailed survey of the area around where the bus had been buried, she found traces of concrete foundation footings that suggested a building had once stood near. The footings were old, dating back to the 1970s, and aerial photographs from that era revealed a small structure that had been demolished sometime in the mid-property records showed that the land had been owned by the Millbrook Construction Company, a local business that had been involved in numerous municipal. The company had been owned by Robert Hayes, the same man who had been the director of Camp Whispering Pines, the destination the children had never reached. This connection sent shockwaves through the investigation team and provided the first concrete lid they had found. Hayes had died in 1997, taking whatever secrets he might have known to his grave. But the investigation into his background revealed a pattern of financial difficulties and questionable business practices that had plagued him throughout the night. His construction company had been on the verge of bankruptcy when the children disappeared, and he had been facing several lawsuits from creditors and former employees. The FBI's financial investigation revealed that Hayes had been involved in a complex fraud scheme involving the construction of substandard buildings using inferior materials while charging premium prices. The scheme had been discovered by a construction inspector named Daniel Fletcher, who had been preparing to file a report with state authorities when he mysteriously disappeared in May 1983. Just weeks before the school bus incident. Fletcher's disappearance had been investigated at the time, but the case had gone cold when no evidence of foul play was found. His family had been told that he had probably left town to avoid his own financial problems, but the timing of his disappearance now seemed highly suspicious. The FBI began to piece together a theory that Fletcher had been murdered to prevent him from exposing the fraud, and that the school bus incident had been part of a larger cover-up. The investigation team discovered that Hayes had not acted alone. Financial records revealed connections to several other prominent community members, including the mayor of Millbrook, the county sheriff, and the president of the school board. All of these men had been involved in awarding contracts to Hayes's construction company, and all had received substantial kickbacks in return for their cooperation. The conspiracy had been elaborate and far-reaching. Hayes and his associates had been systematically defrauding the county for years, using their positions of trust to award contracts to the construction company, while ensuring that building inspections were either cursory or completely falsified. The sheik had made them wealthy, but it had also made them vulnerable to exposure. When Daniel Fletcher had begun to investigate the substandard construction, he had uncovered evidence that could have sent all of them to prison. The conspirators had decided that he had to be silenced, and they had murdered him to protect their secret. But Fletcher had been more thorough than they had realized, and he had shared his suspicions with his brother, who lived in another state. The brother, Thomas Fletcher, had been preparing to contact federal authorities when he learned of the school bus disappearance. Realizing that his brother's murder might be connected to the missing children, he had begun his own investigation. But before he could make progress, he too had been killed in what appeared to be a random robbery that had gone wrong. The FBI's investigation revealed that both Fletcher brothers had been murdered by the same person, a hired killer who had been brought in from out of state to eliminate anyone who might threaten the conspiracy. The killer had been paid handsomely for his services, but he had also been the weak link in the chain that would eventually lead to the truth. The forensic examination of the bus had revealed microscopic traces of a rare type of concrete that had been used in only one construction project in the area during the night. That project had been the construction of a new county courthouse, built by Hayes's company using the same substandard materials and methods that had characterized all of his work. The concrete traces had been found on the undercarriage of the bus, suggesting that it had been driven through wet concrete at some point during its final journey. Construction records showed that the courthouse foundation had been poured on June 15, 1983, the day after the children disappeared. This timing was too coincidental to ignore, and investigators began to focus their attention on the courthouse construction. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the courthouse revealed disturbing anomalies beneath the building's foundation. The readings suggested the presence of organic matter in areas where only concrete and steel should exist. The implications were harrowing, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The 17 children and 3 adults had not simply vanished. They had been murdered and entombed beneath the very building that represented justice in their community. The decision to excavate beneath the courthouse was not made lightly. It required court orders, extensive planning, and the cooperation of multiple agencies. The building would have to be temporarily evacuated, and the excavation would likely damage the structure beyond repair. But the families of the missing children demanded answers, and the evidence pointed inexorably to what lay beneath the courthouse steps. The excavation began on a cold morning in March 2026, almost exactly 43 years after the killer had disappeared. Heavy machinery carefully removed sections of the courthouse floor,
while forensic specialists stood ready to examine whatever was uncovered. The work was slow and methodical, with every scoop of concrete and soil carefully examined for evidence. The first discovery came on the second day of excavation. A small piece of pink fabric, faded but still recognizable as part of a child's clothing, was found embedded in the concrete foundation. DNA analysis would later confirm that it belonged to 8-year-old Sarah Chen, the quiet girl who had loved to collect rocks and press flowers between the pages of books. As the excavation continued, more evidence emerged. A small tennis shoe that belonged to Tommy Rodriguez was found buried beneath tons of concrete. One of the Collins twins' matching water bottles was discovered crushed but identifiable. Each discovery was another confirmation of the terrible truth that was slowly being revealed. The forensic anthropologists worked carefully to preserve every piece of evidence. They found bone fragments scattered throughout the concrete, indicating that the victims had been killed elsewhere, and their remains mixed into the liling material. The method was brutal and efficient, designed to ensure that the bodies would never be found and that the truth would remain buried forever. The evidence suggested that the children and adults had been taken from the bus at the construction site on the morning of June 4. They had been held captive for several hours before being systematically murdered, probably during the night when the construction site would have been deserted. Their bodies had then been dismembered and mixed into the concrete that would form the courthouse foundation the following day. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community and the nation. The idea that children had been murdered and their remains used as building materials was almost too horrible to comprehend. The courthouse, which had served as a symbol of justice for over 40 years, was now revealed to be a tomb containing the remains of innocent victims. The investigation into who had committed these terrible crimes now focused on the conspirators who had been involved in the original fraud scheme. Robert Hayes was dead, but several of his associates were still alive. The former mayor of Millbrook, now 87 years old and living in a nursing home, was questioned extensively, but claimed to have no memory of the events due to advanced dementia. The former county sheriff, William Burke, was more forthcoming when confronted with the evidence. Now 79 years old, and facing the prospect of spending his remaining years in prison, Burke agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. His confession would provide the final pieces of the puzzle that investigators had been seeking for over 4 decades. According to Burke's statement, the plan to murder the children had not been premeditated. The conspiracy had originally focused solely on eliminating Daniel Fletcher and covering up the construction fraud. But when Fletcher's brother had begun investigating, and when the school bus had unexpectedly stopped at a rest area near the construction site, the conspirators had panicked and made a terrible decision. Hayes had been at the construction site that morning, overseeing the preparation for the foundation pour scheduled for the next day. When the school bus had pulled into the nearby rest area, he had recognized an opportunity to eliminate potential witnesses and create a distraction that would divert attention from the murder of the Fletcher brother. Working with Burke and 2 other men who were now dead, Hayes had approached the bus under the pretense of offering assistance. The driver, Frank Morrison, had been suspicious, but before he could react, he had been overpowered and killed. The teachers, Margaret Stone and David Collins, had tried to protect the children, but they too had been murdered when they attempted to resist. The 17 children had been loaded into a van and taken to the construction site, where they had been held in a temporary building while the conspirators decided what to do with them. For several hours, the men had debated whether to release the children or to silence them permanently. In the end, their fear of exposure had won out over their humanity. Burke's confession provided details that were almost too painful to hear. The children had been terrified but had tried to comfort each other in their final hour. Some had asked for their parents, others had tried to be brave for the younger ones. All had died believing that someone would come to rescue them, never knowing that their trusted community leaders had become their execution. The method of murder had been chosen for its efficiency and the impossibility of discovery. The children had been given sedatives to make them unconscious, then killed quickly to minimize their suffering. Their bodies had been dismembered and mixed with the concrete, ensuring that they would never be found and that their families would never have closure. The revelation of Burke's confession brought a mixture of relief and horror to the families of the victim. After more than 4 decades of wondering, they finally knew what had happened to their loved ones. But the truth was more terrible than anything they had imagined. and the knowledge that their children had been murdered by people they had trusted was almost unbearable. Linda Chen, now 74 years old and in failing health, listened to the details of her daughter's murder with stoic dignity. She had waited her entire adult life for answers, and while the truth was painful, it was better than the uncertainty that had plagued her for so many years. "At least now I know Sarah is at peace," she said. "She's not suffering somewhere, wondering why no one came to save her." Maria Rodriguez, now 86 and confined to a wheelchair, was too frail to fully understand the implications of the confession. But when her granddaughter explained that Tommy had been found, that his remains would finally receive a proper burial, the old woman wept tears of both sorrow and relief. Her decades of prayers had finally been answered, even if not in the way she had hoped. The Collins parents, now both in their late 70s, held each other as they listened to the details of their twins' final hours. The knowledge that Emma and Ethan had tried to comfort each other in their last moments was both heartbreaking and somehow comforting. They had faced death together as they had faced everything else in their short lives. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and emotionally draining. Burke was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole despite his cooperation with the investigation. The families had demanded the death penalty, but Burke's advanced age and his assistance in solving the case had convinced prosecutors to accept a plea bargain. Several other conspirators were charged with various crimes related to the fraud scheme and the subsequent cover-up. Most were elderly and in poor health, but the families insisted that justice be served regardless of the defendants' ages. The trials dragged on for months, with each hearing bringing new revelations about the scope of the conspiracy and the corruption that had infected the community. The courthouse where the children's remains had been discovered was demolished as soon as the excavation was complete. The site was turned into a memorial garden, with a monument listing the names of all 20 victims of the conspiracy. The garden became a place of pilgrimage for people from around the world who had followed the case and wanted to pay their respects to the victims. The remains of the children and adults were carefully collected and identified through DNA analysis. After 43 years, the families were finally able to hold funeral services for their loved ones. The services were held together in a ceremony that brought the community together in a way that nothing had since the original disappearance. Sarah Chen was buried next to her parents' plot, with her favorite stuffed rabbit placed beside her in the small coffin. Tommy Rodriguez was laid to rest in the Catholic cemetery where his parents were buried, with his grandmother finally able to say goodbye to the boy she had raised with such love. The Collins twins were buried side by side, just as they had lived, with matching headstones that bore their names and the dates that marked their short lives. The other children were similarly honored, each receiving the burial that their families had dreamed of for over 4 decades. The teachers, Margaret Stone and David Collins, were remembered as heroes who had died trying to protect their students. Frank Morrison, the bus driver, was honored for his years of faithful service and his ultimate sacrifice. The case became a landmark in law enforcement, studied by investigators around the world as an example of how persistence and modern forensic techniques could solve even the coldest of cases. The FBI established a new protocol for investigating mass disappearances, and the case file became required reading for agents specializing in cold case investigation. The media coverage of the resolution was extensive, but it was different from the sensationalized reporting that had characterized the earlier phases of the case. The focus was now on honoring the victims and helping the families heal, rather than exploiting their tragedy for entertainment. Documentaries were made that told the story with dignity and respect, and the case became a cautionary tale about the corruption that can fester in small communities when good people fail to speak up. The psychological impact of the case on the community of Millbrook was profound and lasting. The revelation that trusted leaders had been capable of such evil shattered the town's sense of innocence and security. Many families moved away, unable to live in a place where such horrible crimes had been committed. Others stayed, determined to rebuild their community on a foundation of truth and transparency. The schools implemented new safety protocols and background check procedures that went far beyond what was required by law. Parents became more vigilant about their children's activities, and the casual trust that had once characterized the community was replaced by a more cautious approach to child safety. The annual summer trips that had been so popular before 1983 were never resumed, the memory of what had happened making such excursions unthinkable. As the legal proceedings concluded and the media attention gradually faded, the families of the victims were left to process their grief and try to find some measure of peace. The knowledge of what had happened was both a blessing and a curse, providing closure while also forcing them to confront the reality of their loved one's suffering. Support groups were established to help the families cope with their trauma, and counselors specializing in long-term grief worked with them to develop strategies for moving forward. Some found comfort in advocacy work, using their experience to help other families of missing persons. Others chose to retreat from public life, focusing on their remaining family members and trying to rebuild their lives. The case also had a profound impact on law enforcement procedures and the investigation of missing persons cases. The 43-year gap between the crime and its resolution highlighted the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining active investigations, even when cases seemed hopeless. New technologies and techniques were developed specifically to address cold cases, and the success in solving the Millbrook case provided hope for families of other missing persons. The construction industry also faced scrutiny in the aftermath of the case. New regulations were implemented to prevent the kind of fraud that had made the murders possible, and inspection procedures were strengthened to ensure that substandard materials could not be used in public buildings. The case became a textbook example of how corruption in one area could lead to violence and tragedy in unexpected ways. As the years passed, the Memorial Garden became a place of healing for the community. Visitors from around the world came to pay their respects to the victims and to learn about the case that had captivated international attention. The garden was maintained by volunteers, many of whom had no direct connection to the victims but felt moved by their story to contribute to their memory. The families of the victims found different ways to honor their loved ones' memory. Some established scholarships in their children's names, while others worked to improve child safety programs in school. The Collins family opened a summer camp for disadvantaged children, ensuring that the dream of outdoor education that had cost Emma and Ethan their lives would live on in a positive way. Linda Chen, despite her advanced age and failing health, became an advocate for families of missing persons. She worked with law enforcement agencies to develop better communication protocols and support systems for families going through the trauma of having a loved one disappear. Her work helped dozens of other families navigate the difficult process of searching for missing relatives. The case also sparked renewed interest in other cold cases from the same era. Investigators began re-examining unsolved disappearances and murders from the 1980s. Looking for connections to the Millbrook conspiracy or similar patterns of corruption and cover-up. Several other cases were solved as a result of the attention generated by the school bus investigation.
The story of the 17 children who disappeared on a summer trip in 1983 became more than just a true crime case. It became a symbol of the importance of truth, the power of persistence, and the need for communities to protect their most vulnerable members. The 43 years that passed between the crime and its resolution served as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still be achieved through the dedication of those who refused to give up. As the 50th anniversary of the disappearance approached, the community of Millbrook began planning a commemoration that would honor the victims while also celebrating the resolution of the case. The event would bring together the surviving family members, the investigators who had worked on the case, and the community members who had never stopped believing that the truth would eventually come to light. The legacy of the 17 children and 3 adults who died on that June day in 1983 lived on in the changes that their case had brought about. Their deaths had not been in vain if they could prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. The Memorial Garden stood as a testament to their memory and a reminder that even in the darkest times, the truth would eventually prevail. The buried school bus had finally given up its secrets, and with those secrets came a measure of peace for the families who had waited so long for answers. The mystery that had haunted a community for over 4 decades was finally solved, and the 17 children could finally rest in peace, knowing that their story had been told and their justice had been served.